mission accepted. Right. So let's go back to the very early days. And the early days means circa 50 years ago. And he was the famous story. He went to America to see great leaders. And he did see some very great leaders, very great Jewish leaders. And it was in this meeting which he had with the Rebbe himself that was his turning point. And with hindsight, a turning point for us all. He went in to see the Rebbe, and he was who he was, virtually a genius. Well, genius. He first in philosophy in Oxford, he got a first there, and went to Cambridge, did the same. Absolutely brilliant. And he had his thoughts about his own career. And the Rebbe intervened in a conversation, and he said, "You should be a rabbi." There was nothing further from his mind that he should be a rabbi. And it was the Rebbe's insistence again and again, and he followed that up with a lot more effort. So I would just want to pay tribute to my friend, Jonathan, who I loved. I learned to love after our association for so many years, that this was an extraordinary turning point in his life. But let's salute him for having the ability or wisdom to follow that path. If anybody would come to you and say to you, "We want you to change your lifestyle. You've been going in a certain direction with a certain impetus, and suddenly to turn it round," it would be, and I confess, I can't say that I would be very happy to hear that when somebody's directing me to go in an opposite direction. And therefore, that was brave. But that bravery must have come from a humility. So notwithstanding his brilliance, a hallmark of his personality, he was not in it for himself. He downgraded himself. A famous TED talk he gave, that the I, which has cultivated the iPhone, I feel, I want, should be, as a solution for mankind's problem, would be a we. And he's taken the fullness and the intensity of the mystical tradition who took themselves out from the equation, focusing on something outside himself. So that is that made an immense impression upon me. Just to go a little further, we made a trip to Cambridge University while he was there. He invited us to come to Cambridge University. And there were four of us, and we were all cramped into the Morris Minor car, Oliver Sholem, and we were all cramped, and obviously, we came late. Anybody who's been to Cambridge would know that driving in Cambridge is very difficult because there's all one-way streets. And inevitably, with our eyes on the clock for Shabbos, imminently, we had no choice but to drive through against the traffic up a one-way street. Mm-hmm. He was standing outside waiting for us to come, and lo and behold, he had a new one-liner. You know, these Lubavitchers, they know how to go against the current. But that visit cemented a lot of our relationship with him, and it further taken up in continuous engagements with him. In 1965, the Chabad Lubavitch house was officially opened. And we had a series of celebrations, and one of them was a celebration for the students, who by that time we had a little activity going on with the students. And prominent among the 120 people who visited the new center, and we had this engagement with a great rabbi called Rabbi Zalman Posner, who he was supposed to lead the conversation, which he did. But then there was a young man in the audience who put his hand up to ask a question. Well, after 20 minutes of this question, Rabbi Posner turned to him and said, young man, was that a question or a statement? Well, it was a mixture of both. But he stole the show on that occasion, because his investigation and his prying into the inner workings of Chabad with its mystical base was so articulate that it riveted people around who found themselves learning and studying and learning from that one question, that one 20-minute question. Let me go a little further. Skip to 1984. 1984, 83. He was, I think, the principal of Jews College at the time, and he was authoring books, a few little books. And I asked him to study the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in its original. He always wanted the original, which was Yiddish. And we studied for over a year, many months later. Each week we studied a chapter of the Rebbe's teachings for that particular Sidra. And he would come back a week later and he would deliver his translation, which with a bit of editing, we submitted and we sent around in a weekly message. Eventually, it turned out to be a book, and it was called Torah Studies, which was among the earlier books, or earliest books, which he wrote in 1984. It was known among the Babbage inner circles that if you want to sell books in Wyoming or Utah or Ohio or Brooklyn, probably the most popular book would be this Torah Studies, because he took the world by storm. I don't say that lightly, because he set a new level in understanding of the Rebbe's teachings. And while I was studying with him, and I was in the give and take, and he would offer a translation of something, and I would offer more a translation in the vernacular, which I considered myself to be quite an expert in the vernacular. But then I learned that he was teaching me English, and not just English, the connotations. The connotations were very important. And he would say to me with a smile, if you use your translation, you're opening up this translation to be interpreted by secular philosophy in a way which will be contrary to what message you wish to give. And I listened, and I used corrections and guidance, which took us like walking between the raindrops, not getting involved in something alien to the Jewish spirit. So that book, which was produced, which was clearly a translation of the Rebbe Sikha, was very loyal to the word, to the ideas, but he stepped clear of any hiccup that could ensue. And that I found that probably one of the most remarkable experiences I ever had. And as I said, I became very close to him and very involved with his thinking. And he was my mentor in fine-tuning words which were not the raw vernacular, which 90% of us, when we translate anything, it's the vernacular. And even the King James's version of the Bible is also a very interesting work, but in the beginning means in the beginning God created. And it's not exactly like that. It works slightly differently. So that is a tribute I've been itching to give for many, many years, and it's unknown to people. And this really lies at the very, very core of his articulation with the media of all ranges, whether it was the newspaper, whether it was a speech, whether it was a radio program, a TV program, whatever it was, he never faltered in this communication, in embracing the widest group of people. He had a lens, and he spoke and saw things through this lens, which was, can't say total, but very, very broad indeed. Let me go further. In 1982, he, with Elaine, went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I got this fact, which I had forgotten, from my daughter, who was for 1 year in New York. She's in Dallas today. And she invited them for lunch, and they had lunch, and after the lunch, they went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Mm-hmm. So that was a great moment, because he had met the Lubavitcher Rebbe many, many years before. And this was in a time when he was very involved in the leadership of Anglo Jewry. And then I want to quote a memorial address. Now, this memorial address was at the Shloshim mourning period after the Rebbe's passing. The Rebbe passed away in July 1994. And it was maybe early September that he agreed to give this memorial address. It was chaired by David Young, and he gave an introduction. I've just seen a transcript of that just a few days ago. Joseph has a copy of the recording, and I hope people will take advantage to listen to this recording, because it is one of the greatest intellectual academic levels of translation and understanding. There were 1,000 people in Logan Hall who were over the moon, but to take it all in, none of us could take it all in. And in this talk, he spoke many things, but he pronounced a thought which was, and he developed this thought, that the quintessential unity of the Jewish people is not that they are universally collected in blessings or curses, or blessings, but in one particular reference, which was when a person trips and falls. He found a very obscure source, rabbinic source. In fact, it was from none other than the author of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. And I urge everyone who wants to understand how this ability was achieved and what lay behind the brilliance of his insights, yes, fine-tuned by the profound secular philosophy, but at the same time balanced, so that here you had a challenge to the secular philosophy on its own terms. And being a leader and a very strong will to communicate, he managed to that. And that is the secret, I believe, for his unbelievable success. I think unprecedented success. Of course, he benefited from the particular time era we're in with communications. The media had developed itself so widely that he had the greatest opportunity. And many of the accolades he's received have been from people who were just amazed by this power of communication without plumbing the depths of where it came from. So there's a lot to talk about that. Then he went in 1994, I think he went 1996, 2 years after the passing of the Rebbe. He went with my son Mendy to visit the resting place, which is called the Ohel, the tent, the final resting place of the Rebbe. And my son sent me in this report, and he asked the reasonable questions, what's the point of it? And he took on explanations, and it cemented even more deeply his association with the Rebbe, meaning to say, not in the physical sense, of course, that real union is through the mind and through the soul. I do believe he was a very passionate man. Yes, controlled, but the fire that he breathed out was shaped by his distillation of the mystical aspect. And he was a man who was ready to give of himself. I urged him once, I said, Jonathan, I think you should reply to people individually. And of course he smiled, he said, I'm not a Rebbe. But he became pretty close to harnessing those truths in a universal way and in a particular way. And finally, just to remind you, I had numerous occasions to welcome him as a guest speaker for a fundraising for the Faivish Foundation, always with wit and charm. And also, we selected him to give a presentation of some very obscure, obtuse with such excellence and with such purity. I'm sure these, and one day they will come out as with other speeches he's made. Judaism, which he had so deeply. Yes, and then I corresponded with him, and he
Rabbi, I think we may have lost you for a moment.
Hello? I'm not back.
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear
Yes. Okay, right. Back on again. So I was coming to the end of this little presentation because I wanted to allow you all to participate. And really, this is, if it's going further, I would like everyone to participate and raise the questions which will give me the opportunity to respond as much as I can to those questions. So thank you very much for listening to this little presentation, and the appreciation will go on for a long, long time. Thank you very much. John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
A masterpiece of tribute.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Justin.
What I found so exhilarating about his train of thought was the way that he wove his understanding of secular philosophers, perhaps Aristotle and other people through the years, with the teachings of the Rebbe, with the beliefs of Judaism. How do you believe that his understanding of secular philosophy actually enhanced his communication ability?
I believe the more profoundly he understood the subtlety of philosophy, and he was so well groomed with all the philosophers that it primed him into the rare areas which diverse from Jewish philosophy. He recalled a story when he was speaking in Logan Hall that when he was studying at the Lubavitch Chabad yeshiva in Israel for 9 months, he was talking with the students around him. And one of the students said to him, "The difference between myself and yourself," the student said, "is that you believe the world exists. And then God also exists. We believe that God exists, and we struggle to find how the world exists." So this confrontation, he quoted this confrontation in his mind, which was to his credit. It's not just the repeating of this little story. He understood what godliness is, that God created the world, and because he created and creates the world continuously, that is the source of life. We here, all of us, sitting below, we see the world as real. And we struggle to find God's role in it. But the mystic, the great mystic, say Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the author of the Zohar, he was taken so much by the fact that the God exists that he struggled to find rationale for his existence. Now, when a person who is steeped and knowledgeable and the variations and various philosophers on the one hand, and on the other hand, steeped with a spiritual attachment, this wasn't just a rational attachment. He had a deep spiritual attachment to God from his youth. And that never wavered. That never wavered. And it developed and cultivated. He cultivated it so that he was the master at the seeing through the secular philosophy, which he was very well schooled in, to see the fundamental divergence between a biblical perspective and biblical perspective, yes, fine-tuned by the mystical dimension. And it was, this is the dream coalition, so to speak, the dream coalition. Yes?
What did he achieve?
Can't hear you.
What did he achieve?
What did he achieve?
Martin's
Well,
question.
right. I'm speaking this little talk to you on the basis of my expectation or understanding that the volumes that have been written, not just by him, but about him, especially in these last 7 days. This is the day after the Shiva. There's been hundreds, thousands of appreciation for what he achieved. So, Martin, I would like to believe that you are looking at the media, and you should find out what he achieved.
Jewish news. That's a cop-out.
Okay, I'll tell you the answer then, which is long-winded, but I'll make it as short as possible. He was a major communicator to millions of Jews and millions of non-Jews on Judaism. There rarely have people been able. Okay, the first revolution was the printing in 1490. After that, again, books, media. But this level of communication, which he has riding what is, I must confess, a tiger. He has controlled that media capability and driven into millions of hearts and minds. That, I think, should be a summary of his achievements. If you ask blandly, what are his achievements? So if that's closer, then please, I'll be very pleased to hear from you, Martin, that it is closer. And if it's not closer, we'll have to spend more time.
Very good answer. You've answered my question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We were honoured to have had Lord Rabbi Sachs at Marble Arch every Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and we enjoyed the question time. And I think he possibly never failed to answer any question adroitly and informatively. What I wanted to ask you was, when do you think the incisive moment was when he decided to go and see the Rebbe? What actually motivated him, or is it something he'd always wanted to do?
Well, I only have the same evidence that you've heard and you mentioned before, that he was a student in Cambridge and he took a Greyhound bus across America to go and see America, which is very natural for a student to do. And coming into New York, he decided he wants to see the great minds, the great people of New York. And one of the leaders he met was a very, very great intellectual and a great rabbi. It was Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who has written, and incidentally, this Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, I don't know whether Rabbi Sachs knew about it. He was a very close friend of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who he had met in Berlin when they were studying in 1933 at the same university. He were both in Berlin University in 1933, and they had a very good relationship. So he chose him because at that time he was the spiritual head of the Yeshiva University, and he saw him, and he saw a number of other great people. So it's not, it's easier. There's no just going to see the Rebbe. He went to see a number of intellectuals who he tested them. And in fact, he once wrote an article, I think it was 1965. It was in the magazine published by the Yeshiva University, and he wrote a 25-page letter offering an alternative to Rabbi Soloveitchik's book, The Lonely Man of Faith, The Lonely Man of Faith. And in this, he challenged the idea that a person, in order to be faithful, has to be necessarily lonely, away from other influences. He cited biblical passages from the Spies, the story of the Spies, which were given an interpretation by the Rebbe. And it was so magnificent. I chose this as one of my study sessions with the Shia in the past 40 years. And so he was able, because, as I say before, he had drunk deeply from both wells, so much so that the cartoon frequently appeared in the Jewish Chronicle of Rabbi Sachs with a head showing a cap of a professor, lecturer, and on the other hand, the face of a man with a beard. So people would actually know, who are you? Who are you? Well, he was both, but the right side won over. And talking about right side, by the way, let me tell you another little story. Before he became the chief rabbi of the United Synagogue, he confided in me and talked to me about the following. He said to me, what do you think I should do if I'm offered? Obviously, it was pretty close to being offered, but he said, what should I think I do about if they offer me this position of chief rabbi? Do you think I should take it, or do you think it'd be too confining, and et cetera, et cetera? So I said, I'm sorry, but as usual, that question has to be referred to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he said, obviously, okay. So he wrote a letter, a 2-page letter, and he put down the question, and he put down what he's been doing, what his history, what background, et cetera, et cetera. And I submitted it to the Rebbe, and there were 2 responses, 2 marks of response. He had written, if I am offered the position of chief rabbi, should I accept? And the Rebbe, very often he did this, he took his pen and circled around the should I and transformed it into I should. But the second remark was in answer to part of his history, when he was talking to the Rebbe about what's he been doing. He said, when I was in Jews college, he says, I founded a magazine called Yamino. And this was his vehicle to promulgate his ideas and thoughts. A few other people contributed as well, but mainly it was his. So when the Rebbe saw this remark, I created a magazine called Yamina. The Rebbe said, I'll just say it in Hebrew first, and then I'll translate. Halo ze kol inyan sheberav b'Yisrael lelech tomid el hayamino. Behold, this is the way of every rabbi in Israel to go towards the right, etc., etc. So he, not quipped, but he said, well, you see, the Rebbe gave me an answer, but he also gave me a direction. The Yamino is, God forbid that we should translate Yamino in the political sense. It was in the sense of becoming more attached and more attached to higher levels of Judaism and insight. So he took this very clearly and he followed this. So I think that would give some indication of his very early contact with the Rebbe and how the Rebbe guided him further and finally tuned his mission.
Can I just ask a question? I thought the remark you made about drinking from both wells was very powerful. And why cannot, and I don't expect a direct answer, why is it in Jewish education or in the Jewish seminaries, wherever there is so little drinking from the other well? The drinking is all from one well. Would it not be a blessing to the Jewish people that there was more drinking from both wells?
Yes, I hear that question very loud and clear. It's difficult to answer that question other than going back to the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe himself drank very deeply from both wells. As I cited with his sojourn in Berlin University, later on he went on to the Sorbonne and etc. And even whilst he was in America and serving as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he had arrangements with his secretary that they would supply him with all the updates in a magazine of science. So he was fully abreast, as he was in the Torah dimension, he was fully abreast, up to date, with different discoveries, etc., etc. And he had to advise, for example, on people's health. And they said it's impossible, this is not possible. So said, what about going to this idea, which the Rebbe had the task to introduce health solutions to people who were being covered by doctors. So he kept fully abreast. They asked Justin that question to the Rebbe himself. You, who studied in universities, why is it? Why are you not advising your followers to study in the universities, as the question you asked? And the Rebbe said, I know, because I learned in the universities, I know the pitfalls. Now, taken at surface, on the surface, that was a comment in comparing the moral disposition of students in the 1930s to the moral disposition of students at the end of the 20th century. It was 70 years. And everybody will acknowledge there's a difference. However, the caveat must come that when a good friend of mine, Professor Block from the University of Western Ontario, he became a Lubavitcher Chassid in 1957 whilst he was studying in Harvard, and he was studying philosophy. And becoming so enamored with Chabad, he said, I intend to leave university and go back and go to the yeshiva. And the Rebbe said, no, stay in Harvard. As an antidote, if you feel you need an antidote to Harvard, I advise you to read deeply the teachings of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, who spoke in philosophical terms and argued all the arguments. This Professor Block, to sidetrack, he said to me when he was teaching Aristotle's philosophy to the university, after he finished each lecture, he said, look, I want you to know, if you don't accept it, I'm happy. So he was riding two horses, as all people. So it's a question of on the individual, but for the masses, the first underpinning of Jewish faith comes from exclusive learning of Judaism and become very familiar with the Bible, with the Talmud, etc., etc. And this is something which has proven to be successful with people at a later stage of their life when they're looking for income. It's not just a menial jobs he's talking about. It says you want to go and study, go and study. But at least at this time, you're well grounded in the essentials. I hope that goes some way to answering this question.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying. Nevertheless, I don't think this message is spread around wide enough within the, shall we say, the accepting community.
Yeah, my answer to that is, to let you know what you probably know, is that Chabad is still, in some rare circles, ostracized because of its openness to the wider Jewish population.
Exactly.
That is what it is. So really, Chabad is warring on two fronts. Sorry to use that expression. The number of letters the Rebbe wrote in his lifetime were about 10,000 letters. And a number of these letters are directed to people who did not accept his teachings. But this argument or differentiation goes right back to the time of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, when he was the one who advocated and practiced the mystical dimension. The other rabbis were certainly involved in the practical halachic application of Jewish law in very mundane areas. So that was a rare occasion. He had a few followers, and a few followers followed him. But if you know the history of the Chabad movement with Rabbi Shneur Zalman al-Liadi, he had tremendous opposition from the Vilna Gaon.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And,
Except that Vilna Gaon was also very knowledgeable on Western philosophy.
Correct.
Can I interject? I was born before the war. I was evacuated to non-Jewish people, and I went to 2 non-Jewish schools. My grounding, therefore, in Judaism was very limited. I could read moderately, and I went to an Orthodox synagogue because my parents were traditional and they kept kosher. I had no understanding of Jewish philosophy or Jewish teachings or background except what I was taught at Cheder and the basic stories in the Bible. For me, when I listened to sermons pre-Jonathan Sacks, I was left behind. When Jonathan came along, I felt engaged. I understood what he was saying. He communicated with me, and probably that was the precursor to my sitting here today and discussing this with you. And I feel, in answer to Martin, that's the effect that Jonathan had on so many people. They were able to understand what he was talking about. It related to them. They felt comfortable with it, and therefore they grew in their Judaism and discovered its depths.
Can I answer you? I'm a greedy person. I think that Jonathan Sacks was a very good communicator. He was a very good leader. He was a very good politician. But I also want something else. I want holiness. So the question I wanted to ask Faivish was, we've all met, I mean, the Rebbe was a holy man. We've all met holy men who necessarily aren't in the public eye. But was Jonathan a holy man?
No. Yeah, well, I think he's answered.
Well, what I'm saying, I think I mentioned before, he was a shadow. The communication was a great skill, but to ascribe to Jonathan holiness, he would be the last to express himself in those terms. And for that measure of holiness, I must explain my perception of the Rebbe in holiness. It's very difficult to understand or to see holiness. And I admit I'm the first to admit this. I do not see holiness. It's not, I can see through my senses, the 5 senses of touch and taste and smell and hearing and seeing. There are more transcending levels in which to pick up holiness. But the indications, Martin, to you would help is following. A man who sacrifices himself to God by doing that one major act of really giving up his natural career as an academic or as a lawyer, which he was married to, that was an act of sacrifice. Sacrifice, which we call now Mesirat Nefesh, when a person devotes himself to God in an extreme way or in a minor way, that sacrifice brings holiness. Now, to know how much a person has sacrificed, difficult to know, really impossible to know. And there's many Hasidic teachings which talk about a person who is a scholar, who loves God and fears God, but all for his own sake. It's a development of the I. I love God. Oh, let me just share with you a remarkable story which I've not shared with you. In 1959, I was a student at the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in New York. The celebrations over Sukkot and Simchat Torah were tremendous. 48 hours on, again, more and more. And it finally ended on the early hours of the Simchat Torah morning. And at 4 o'clock, we went, after our meals, at 3 o'clock, we went back to 770 to listen to the Rebbe, who would customarily hand out a little vodka to say l'chaim, with his wishes. As he was talking and teaching us new song, he was telling the story of the classification of what I've just said, that a person can be a lover of God. He loves God. But at the same time, he is. It's me. I love God. And as he was telling this story, a beautiful story, and the Rebbe broke into tears as he was saying, a person who is can also love, but the ultimate level of fusion into the oneness of a God, in Zohar it's called Ishtavor Begufa de Malka, to become subsumed, consumed into the body of the king, which is the metaphor to lose one's own person in the bosom of this oneness which we can never understand. That is the hallmark of the ultimate bonding with God, losing oneself within him. Now, you asked me about Jonathan Sacks. He was in every ways maybe like myself and many hundreds and thousands of others, a human being who strove, like we all do, to become closer to God through studying the Torah and guarding the mitzvot. Did he have a degree of that holiness? I think he did. In his devotion and in his abnegation of the self for the better interests of the Jewish community. I hope that goes some way to answer your question. Martin, we all have a holiness in a certain way, in a small way, but there's no Jew without holiness. No Jew in the world without holiness. Everyone.
That's the best thing you've said today.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Can I come in on this? Rabbi Vogel, I'm very new here, and it's normal for a new boy to stay stum. But I hope you'll forgive me if I can mention to you, I knew Jonathan Sacks well. Nobody could possibly deny his academic brilliance. He was outstanding. But the thing that shone through for me was his humanity. He had the ability to communicate to individuals. his sermons, as John has said, were superb because he put over an esoteric point which could be understood by individuals. For me, he was absolutely fantastic. When I had it in mind to write a book, he gave me a great assistance. But it was the very fact that no one was more important than anyone else. He could relate to the individual as well as to the masses. So when an ordinary individual like myself would speak to him, he concentrated on that individual. He wasn't looking over your shoulder to see who else was around and who you prefer to speak to. You knew he was concentrating on you and what you had said and what his answer was. So you felt that he was actually speaking to you and assisting you. And indeed, he assisted me very greatly. And I'm just one ordinary individual. I recall when I was first looking at the escape from Egypt and who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I was, as usual, in shul reading the notes at the bottom of the Chumash, and there staring at me was the statement that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And that got under my skin because I knew it was wrong. And my seat in the shul is quite close to where he sits. So I wandered over to him and, in my own inimicable fashion, said to him, Rabbi Sachs, I found a mistake in my Chumash. Oh, yes, he said, and I explained to him. And he said, well, he said, you could be right, but what you can't be is negative. If you're going to say who was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus, you have to say who was. And just incidentally, he added, for the last 2,500 years, do bear in mind that most of the Rabbonim have thought that it was Ramses II. I wandered back to my seat a little despondent, but you'll be pleased to know by Ein Kelahenu I decided to accept the challenge. And I wrote my book, Striving for Perfection, found out a great deal and managed to fit the story of Genesis into Egyptian history. And the whole thing comes alight. It's fascinating. He was the one who pushed me into that and helped me along, gave me books to read, and pointed me in the right direction. And he was like that with every individual. And that, to my mind, was his striving for perfection. Because he wasn't just speaking to everybody, he was speaking to the individual. And that really hit home. Forgive me saying that, Rabbi Vogel, because I know that his academic prowess is something that we should all be proud of. But that's what shone through for me.
Well, can I make a point of interest? And I was in Egypt, and I asked the same question: Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And a very bright guy, and he said it was Meneptah, because all the other pharaohs were wrapped in alkaline. In their mummies, they were wrapped in alkaline. But Meneptah was in salt.
Yes, Meneptah actually, they found salt water in his lungs.
That's right.
There is quite a strong point about that. Unfortunately, he couldn't be accurate simply because of Kings 1, chapter 6, verse 1, which tells us that there was 480 years between the Exodus and the 4th year of the reign of King Solomon. And we know that King Solomon lived between 800 and 1000 BCE. That would have taken him into the 8th century BCE, which is just impossible.
You're making a very interesting tour around Egyptian Jewish history, but I just want to tell you that what you just said about his focus equally on individual resonates very deeply with me, because in talking about the greatness of the Faivish Rebbe, his erudition and his knowledge was very, very vast, so on and so forth. But you had the impression when he spoke to you that no thing existed outside you. Now, for Jonathan to have that attitude comes from, he's picked it up either by osmosis or he's picked it up in some way. However he picked it up, it's one of the greatest virtues of a leader, that going back to Egypt, Moses was reputed, as it says in the Medrash, that he was a shepherd. A shepherd, okay. So but why was he chosen as leader? He was chosen leader because if one lamb would wander away from the flock of many thousands, he would pursue the lamb and hold the lamb and bring the lamb back to the flock. Now, you all appreciate that metaphor, and that was the metaphor, obviously, with the Rebbe, who does this and sends people out to goodness knows where to reach a Jew. And Jonathan was doing that globally. And that was something which was very precious. I thank you for that contribution, because I think it comes from a certain humility. And behind it all is a deep humility. And that humility allows him, without discord, to relate even to a boy or a girl, a young boy or a girl. Thank you for that.
Can I just ask you one thing? Can you mention maybe Rabbi Sachs's contribution to Jewish education in England? I think he had his decade of, was it renewal or Jewish education or something, that he was, very focused on improving Jewish education and establishing schools in this country?
Yes, he had those 10 years, year of renewal, but let's be objective about this. His predecessor, Rabbi Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi before him, also spoke very strongly about schools. And there were a number of schools created through Rabbi Jacobowitz's inspiration, and Rabbi Sachs went further to build on the past, and really as a deeper message for Judaism, for Jews. We all come into the world, and after 90 years, 100 years, we pass from the world. Each one of us who develops a